It is the 20th of May, 1941, and the sky above the island of Crete is filled with silk and steel. Thousands of parachutes bloom against the pale Mediterranean blue, drifting down towards olive groves, dry stone walls, and airstrips defended by New Zealand, Australian, British, and Greek troops who have been waiting, dug in, for this very moment. Below, the wind carries the smell of aviation fuel and crushed thyme. Rifle fire crackles up from the hedgerows before the paratroopers of the German 7th Flieger Division even reach the ground. Many of them are still in their harnesses when the shooting begins, swinging helplessly beneath their canopies with nothing in their hands but a pistol or a knife, because their rifles, machine guns, and grenades have been dropped separately, in canisters, to float down under their own parachutes somewhere nearby. Some men land beside their weapon containers. Many do not. Within minutes, exposed and unarmed on open ground, entire sections are cut down before they can even crawl towards cover. Historians continue to debate the precise casualty figures from that first catastrophic morning over Crete, but the pattern of the disaster is not disputed. It would take the Fallschirmjäger, Germany's elite parachute infantry, several more brutal days to secure the island, and the cost would be so severe that Adolf Hitler would never again sanction a major airborne assault of that scale. Yet from the wreckage of that battle, from the memory of young men dying tangled in silk with empty holsters, would come one of the most unusual and forward-thinking rifles of the Second World War, a weapon built around a single contested idea that a soldier's magazine did not have to sit beneath the rifle at all, but could instead be mounted on its side. What followed would divide opinion among the very men who carried it into battle, and would quietly influence the shape of infantry weapons for decades after the guns of that war finally fell silent. The disaster on Crete exposed a problem that German paratroop commanders had been uneasy about for some time. Unlike ordinary infantry, the Fallschirmjäger jumped with almost nothing beyond a sidearm, a knife, and perhaps a few grenades tucked into their smocks. Their principal weapons, the Carabiner 98K rifle, the MP-38 and MP-40 submachine guns, and the MG-34 machine gun, were considered too awkward, too heavy, or too easily damaged to be jumped with directly, so they were packed into padded containers and dropped alongside the men rather than on them. On a calm exercise, this arrangement was merely inconvenient. Under fire, on hostile ground, with defenders already ranging their weapons on the drop zone, it proved close to fatal. Records suggest that on Crete alone, a significant proportion of German airborne casualties occurred in the minutes immediately after landing, while men searched frantically for their weapon canisters under direct enemy fire. The Luftwaffe, which maintained its own chain of command over the paratroop arm, quite separate from the army, could not ignore what its own soldiers had suffered. A rifle was needed that a man could strap to his body during the jump itself, light enough not to hamper the descent, short enough not to snag on rigging lines, yet powerful enough to stand in for a rifle, a light machine gun, and, if necessary, a sniper's weapon all at once. No existing firearm in German service came close to meeting that brief. The Carabiner 98K was accurate and reliable, but strictly a bolt-action weapon, incapable of sustained automatic fire. The MP-40 could spray bullets at close range, but its pistol-caliber cartridge had neither the range nor the stopping power the paratroopers needed once they were fighting in the open. The MG-34, superb as a squad machine gun, was simply too heavy and too bulky for a man to jump with strapped across his chest. Compounding the difficulty, the Luftwaffe's technical office drew up a specification, later known as LC6, that was almost contradictory in its demands. The weapon had to be no longer than around 1 meter, weigh little more than the standard rifle it was replacing, fire the same full-power 7.92 by 57 mm Mauser cartridge used in every other German rifle and machine gun for logistical simplicity, offer both semi-automatic and fully automatic fire, except a bayonet, and even be capable of launching rifle grenades. Ordnance engineers who studied the requirements privately doubted it could be done at all, cramming a rifle firing a cartridge as powerful as the 8mm Mauser into a package barely the size of a submachine gun, while keeping it controllable on automatic fire, was, on paper, close to a contradiction in terms. 3 companies were invited to compete for the contract: Rheinmetall Borsig, Krieghoff, and Johannes Grossfuss, working under intense wartime pressure and material shortages that made the challenge harder still. Whichever firm solved it would be handing the Fallschirmjäger something no other army in the world yet possessed: a genuine individual assault weapon built specifically for the demands of vertical envelopment. Whichever firm failed would leave paratroopers jumping into the next battle just as naked as they had been over Crete. There was also a bureaucratic dimension to the urgency that should not be understated. General Kurt Student, commander of Germany's airborne forces, understood that Crete had very nearly cost the Fallschirmjäger their future as a fighting arm altogether. According to wartime reports circulating within the German High Command, senior figures questioned whether large-scale parachute operations were worth their catastrophic casualty rates, and there was serious discussion of folding the paratroopers into conventional ground infantry divisions where their specialized training would go largely to waste. Student and his staff needed to demonstrate that the losses on Crete stemmed from correctable equipment failures rather than from any fundamental flaw in airborne doctrine itself. A purpose-built weapon, solving the very problem that had cost so many lives on the drop zones of Crete, was as much a matter of institutional survival for the Fallschirmjäger as it was a technical exercise for Luftwaffe engineers. That pressure shaped the timetable as much as it shaped the specification, and it meant the 3 competing firms were working against a deadline measured in months rather than years, at a time when German industry was already straining to supply tanks, aircraft, and artillery to fronts stretching from the Atlantic coast to the steppes of the Soviet Union. It was Rheinmetall Borsig's design, developed under engineer Louis Stange, that ultimately won the competition and became the Fallschirmjäger 42, or FG42. To meet the impossible brief, Stange's team made a series of unconventional choices, and none was more visible or more debated than the decision to mount the 20-round box magazine horizontally on the left side of the receiver rather than beneath it in the conventional position. The logic was elegant on paper. By moving the magazine sideways rather than downward, the trigger mechanism and pistol grip could be shifted much further forward beneath the receiver, allowing the entire weapon to be built shorter without sacrificing barrel length, exactly what the LC6 specification demanded. It also meant a paratrooper firing from the prone position, as riflemen so often had to on open, hedge-lined ground like that on Crete, could keep the weapon's profile lower, since there was no downward projecting magazine catching on the earth in front of him. Forgotten Weapons, among the most respected sources on historical small arms, has explained that the side-mounted magazine allowed the receiver to be kept notably shorter than a conventional bottom-feed design would have permitted, a genuine engineering advantage given how tightly the overall length was constrained. The rifle that emerged weighed a little under 4.5 kilograms unloaded and measured roughly 94 centimeters from muzzle to stock, remarkably compact for a weapon firing a full-power rifle cartridge. Its action was equally inventive. The FG42 fired from a closed bolt when set to semi-automatic, for the sharpest possible accuracy on aimed shots, but switched automatically to firing from an open bolt when set to fully automatic, which helped prevent the barrel overheating and cooking off a round left resting in a hot chamber. A muzzle brake tamed some of the ferocious recoil generated by the 8mm Mauser cartridge at a cyclic rate that, depending on the production variant, ran between roughly 700 and 900 rounds per minute, while a spring-buffered stock absorbed further punishment before it ever reached the firer's shoulder. Early Type 1 rifles featured a dramatically raked pistol grip, intended, it was hoped, to let a paratrooper begin firing almost the instant he touched down, along with a stamped steel skeleton stock and a bipod mounted well back along the handguard. Troops in the field complained that the sharply angled grip was uncomfortable for sustained shooting and that the rearward bipod position increased the spread of automatic fire. So the later Type 2 version adopted a more conventional grip angle, wooden furniture, and a bipod relocated forward near the muzzle to steady the barrel and tighten the shot grouping. The rifle could mount a 4-power telescopic sight for use as an improvised marksman's weapon, and it retained a folding bayonet, satisfying almost every clause of that seemingly impossible LC6 specification. Production, however, never came close to matching demand. Manufactured chiefly by Rheinmetall's works alongside Krieghoff's, wartime shortages of skilled labor and materials meant only around 7,000 FG42s of all variants were ever completed, a fraction of the numbers reached by the Karabiner 98K or the later Sturmgewehr 44. It remained, from beginning to end, a scarce and specialized weapon reserved almost exclusively for the Fallschirmjäger it had been designed to save. Manufacturing the FG42 was never straightforward. Its receiver and many internal components required extensive machining, rather than the stamped metal simplicity that made weapons like the MP40 or the later STG-44 comparatively cheap and fast to produce. And this complexity, combined with the specialized alloys needed for its barrel and bolt, made it an expensive weapon at a moment when Germany's war economy was buckling under the strain of fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. A later production variant, sometimes referred to by collectors and historians as the Type 3 or Model 2, attempted to simplify manufacture by incorporating a wooden stock and butt plate in place of some of the earlier stamped and cast components, and by slowing the cyclic rate slightly to around 750 rounds per minute through a heavier bolt assembly in the hope of improving controllability during automatic fire and easing the strain on the receiver. Even with these refinements, output never rose to meet demand, and many Fallschirmjäger companies fighting in Italy and later in northwestern Europe carried a patchwork of FG-42s, captured Allied weapons, and standard German infantry small arms side by side within the same unit, a reminder that even Germany's most celebrated specialist troops were, by the middle years of the war, rarely equipped as generously as propaganda newsreels like to suggest. Because so few were built, the FG-42 never became the rifle carried by the average German soldier. But where it did appear, its impact on the men who used it was immediate and personal. It saw action during the airborne assault to rescue Benito Mussolini from captivity at Campo Imperatore in September 1943. In the desperate defense of Monte Cassino through the winter and spring of 1943 and 1944, where Fallschirmjäger held the ruined monastery against repeated Allied assaults, and later in the fighting through Normandy and during the Ardennes offensive in the winter of 1944. Paratroopers who carried it into these battles generally valued its accuracy and reach in semi-automatic fire, reporting that it matched the range and precision of the standard Kar 98K, while offering vastly more firepower when needed. Yet many also found the side-mounted magazine a genuinely awkward companion in sustained combat. Loaded, the 20-round magazine sat noticeably off to one side of the receiver, and several accounts from soldiers and post-war analysts describe the resulting lateral imbalance as something the firer had to consciously fight against, particularly when firing fully automatic from a standing or kneeling position, where the offset weight tended to twist the muzzle away from the target with each burst. Exact figures on how many riflemen actively disliked the layout, as opposed to those who simply adapted to it, remain uncertain, since surviving testimony is scattered and often filtered through decades of hindsight. But the criticism appears consistently enough across multiple contemporary and post-war sources to be treated as a genuine, recognized drawback rather than a myth. At Monte Cassino in particular, where Fallschirmjäger regiments held the shattered monastery hilltop against wave after wave of Allied assaults through the early months of 1944, The rifle's compact length and its ability to deliver both aimed single shots against advancing infantry and short automatic bursts to break up close-quarter rushes made it genuinely valued among the defenders. Whatever reservations individual soldiers held about its balance, captured examples recovered by Allied troops in Italy and later in Normandy, following the airborne and glider landings of June 1944, were sent back for technical evaluation, and American and British ordnance officers who examined them noted, sometimes with evident admiration, how much capability Rheinmetall's engineers had managed to compress into so short and light a package. There is no surviving evidence confirming exactly how many individual actions were decided by the FG42 rather than by the more numerous conventional weapons fielded alongside it, and it would be an exaggeration to credit any single German small arm with turning the tide of a battle. What the surviving accounts do confirm is a rifle that consistently punched above its modest production numbers in terms of the impression it left on both the men who carried it and the men who captured it. If you're enjoying this journey through history, subscribing genuinely helps us continue bringing remarkable true stories like this to the channel. Set beside its Allied contemporaries, the FG-42's ambitions become clearer still. The American Browning automatic rifle, or BAR, fired a comparably powerful .30-06 cartridge from a conventional 20-round magazine beneath the receiver, but at close to 7.5 kilograms, it weighed nearly twice as much as the FG-42 and offered no semi-automatic precision fire to speak of, being built purely as a support weapon. The British Bren gun, feeding from the top rather than the side or bottom, was superbly reliable and easy to control, yet at close to 10 kilograms loaded, it was never remotely light enough for a man to jump with. The Soviet DP-28 machine gun and the standard-issue Mosin Nagant rifle occupied entirely separate roles, with nothing in Red Army service attempting the same fusion of rifle and light machine gun that the FG-42 represented. Even the American M1 carbine, itself designed for compactness and issued to paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions, fired a far less powerful pistol-caliber round and could not match the FG-42's range or striking power. In effect, no other combatant nation fielded anything that occupied quite the same space. A genuinely individual jump-ready assault weapon combining rifle-caliber power with true selective fire, though the Germans themselves would soon field a rival solution of their own in the form of the Sturmgewehr 44, chambered for a shorter, lighter intermediate cartridge that many ordnance historians now regard as a more practical template for the future of infantry weapons than the full-power FG-42 ever was. Where the FG-42 sought to compress power into a shrunken package by clever mechanical layout, the STG-44 instead reduced the cartridge itself, a philosophical difference in solving the same underlying problem that would echo through small arms design for the rest of the century. The wider legacy of the FG-42 rests less in the numbers built than in the ideas it proved workable. After the war, American ordnance officers who studied captured examples were, by several accounts, considerably more impressed by the FG-42's engineering than by the STG-44's, and elements of its operating system, its gas-operated action, its spring buffer, and, above all, its belt or feed arrangement thinking, fed directly into the development of the American M60 general-purpose machine gun, which entered service in the 1950s and would go on to serve American forces from Vietnam through to the Gulf War. Design historians generally credit the M60 as drawing on both the FG-42's receiver and trigger mechanism and the MG-42's feed system, a rare instance of two rival wartime designs from the same defeated nation, shaping the standard machine gun of the country that had beaten them. Surviving FG-42s are today extremely rare and highly prized, with genuine examples held in institutions including the Rock Island Auction Company's historical collections, the Royal Armories in Leeds, and various military museums across Europe and North America, where their side-mounted magazines and skeletal early stocks still draw the attention of visitors who have never seen anything quite like them. Historians continue to debate how much the FG42's specific side feed layout genuinely influenced later designs, since most post-war assault rifles reverted to conventional under-receiver magazines for reasons of balance and simplicity. Yet the underlying ambition, one compact selective fire weapon replacing several separate ones in a soldier's hands, would become the governing idea behind almost every service rifle developed from the 1950s onwards. Return for a moment to that morning over Crete, to the men falling through gunfire with nothing in their hands but a pistol. That image, more than any specification document or factory blueprint, is the true origin of the rifle mounted along its own side. Awkward to some who carried it, ingenious to others, imperfect in ways its own users were quick to point out, and yet undeniably years ahead of almost anything else in the world at the time. The FG42 was never issued in the numbers that might have made it decisive, and the very feature that made it so compact, that sideways magazine, remained, for many of the paratroopers who trusted their lives to it, something to be managed rather than loved. But it answered, in steel and walnut and stamped sheet metal, a question written in blood on a Mediterranean hillside. How does a soldier arrive on the battlefield already armed for whatever waits for him? Few of the men rebuilding rifles in Rheinmetall's wartime workshops could have imagined that their answer to one botched airborne invasion would still be studied by weapons historians, held behind glass in national armories, and traced, feature by feature, into the machine guns carried by soldiers born a generation after the war had ended. It was not a perfect weapon. It was not even, in the eyes of many who shouldered it, a comfortable one. But it was proof that even from catastrophe, from young men dying tangled in their own parachute silk for want of a weapon in hand, something genuinely new could be built, imperfect, contested, and unmistakably ahead of its time.